No debate sobre os rumos da economia mundial nesta segunda década do século XXI, a incerteza parece ser o único consenso. As crises, imprevisíveis, se mostram mais severas e frequentes. O epicentro da produção se desloca para os países em desenvolvimento. Os países industrializados se desindustrializam. E as rédeas frouxas sobre o capital financeiro não avalizam um futuro melhor do que os vividos na primeira década. É possível manter taxas de crescimento indefinidamente? Ou estamos diante de uma encruzilhada em que o desenvolvimento terá que ser repensado? Estas são as principais questões esmiuçadas por uma voz dissonante da ortodoxia que prevalece no cenário da economia contemporânea. O pensador marxista inglês David Harvey, que acaba de concluir mais um livro, O Enigma do Capital, a ser lançado em abril nos Estados Unidos. Geógrafo com formação em Cambridge, especialista em sociologia urbana, professor emérito da Universidade Johns Hopkins e ainda hoje lecionando na City University de Nova York, Harvey é um dos mais respeitados intelectuais no mundo acadêmico anglo-saxão pelo rigor teórico de suas ideias sobre a compressão do tempo e espaço nas transformações das últimas décadas, que aceleraram o ciclo de rotação do capital. Nesta entrevista, ele nos oferece seu ponto de vista sobre o mundo e nos revela sua utopia.
David, you see the capitalist development at an inflection point where the 3% compound growth is becoming less and less feasible without the fictions of the asset markets and the financial affairs. In the short run and in the middle run, what can we expect?
I think we've already seen the signs of what the consequences are. And I think it's very significant that over the last 30 years, a lot of the investment has not actually gone into production. It's gone into assets and asset values. It's gone into land rents. It's gone into property prices. It's even gone into the art market. And of course it's gone into stocks and shares. And the financial sector has come up with all sorts of innovations which allow you to make money by playing with money. In other words, over the last 30 years, we've been in a system that has been very crisis-prone. And the crises have nearly always focused on fictitious values. Debt, in particular, has been one of the big ones. Many of the crises have been urban crises because a lot of urban investments are speculative investments. And so this time around it's the foreclosure crisis, it's the housing crisis, and it continues this way with, for example, the crisis of Dubai, overinvestment in the built environment. So in a sense, I would say that this is a foretaste of what is to come. That in the way that these crises sort of moved around the world, but then increasingly moved more rapidly around the world and became deeper, eventually becoming more global, that I think that pattern is likely to be resumed unless we see a radical reconfiguration of the capitalist system.
But actually you see that there's not too much space left for capital surplus absorption.
Yes. This is
a problem.
Yes, this is the problem which I think began to be experienced during the 1980s and 1990s. And now that is why I think it then went into the fictional markets, because it couldn't find the areas for expansion. I mean, during the 19th century, the British had surplus capital and they had abundant places to put it. They could put it in Argentina or South Africa, and of course a lot of it went to the United States. So they didn't have a problem of absorbing their surplus capital because there were all these open spaces. When China became integrated into the global economy, when the Soviet Union and the ex-Soviet bloc became integrated, now that India and Indonesia and the rest of it have become in, you kind of say, well, where is there the surplus capital can go? Yes, there's some areas of Africa and some remote interior regions of Asia that haven't yet been fully colonized or integrated, but that's not like it was in the 19th century when you had the rest of the world to play with.
But let's come back to this inflection point and try to understand to explain better the growth of the so-called emerging economies that includes Brazil and, of course, and mainly China?
I think there are two ways in which surplus capital can be absorbed by geographical expansion. One way is to find some space and say, this is going to be our market. And this is what the British did with India in the 19th century. They said, this is going to be our market, so they destroyed Indian industry. And then they turned India into its great market and they sold all their goods there. The other way in which capital surpluses get absorbed is by capital export. And capital moves to some place and sets up new industries. Now, China is a very interesting case, very different from the way British treated India. Capital moved into China and set up new industries, so that China produces a lot. But as it produces a lot, so it demands a lot from the rest of the world. So, for example, Latin American economies have grown healthily to the degree they have. It's been upon the China trade, because China is demanding an immense amount of raw materials and semi-finished products and some machinery and all the rest of it. And Latin American trade is reoriented from North America to China as a result. Now, that form of geographical expansion has been very much more important over the last 30, 40 years than simply the sort looking of the India sort, you know. So that the developing countries have actually become producers. I mean, Brazil is a producer. And, of course, China is an immense producer. A lot of production moved into the maquila zones of Mexico. It moved into Indonesia. So production has moved to different parts of the world, with the result that much of what used to be the center of capitalism has become deindustrialized. I mean, industry has disappeared from much of the United States and from Britain and also from Germany, and it's got displaced. This is a very different model of geographical expansion, which is not based on clear imperialist domination, although it does, of course, depend very much on multinational corporations, many of which are based in the global north, that then come south and set up their production activities in Brazil or set them up in China. I mean, there's a joke in the United States that the only place where General Motors is profitable is in China.
When we think about China's future, are we talking about global capitalism without hegemony, or are we talking about a new hegemon?
I don't know. That's a very big question which actually is being worked out right now. I think it's very interesting to study it, to see to what degree China is beginning to move into a hegemonic position. But power relations between the great powers are one thing. For instance, it cannot challenge US military power. I mean, the US still has the capacity to destroy the world from 30,000 feet up, not on the ground. The Chinese can do it on the ground, but they can't do it from 30,000 feet up. The difficulty is it can't maintain its hegemony in production. It lost that some time ago. Financially, it constructed hegemony for itself during the 1990s, and that, in a sense, is what has crashed right now. So the big question is, can China actually now reinsert itself into the global economy in such a way that its controlling of global surpluses of capital can actually then start to diminish the power of the United States? I mean, the Chinese own, in many ways, they are the principal creditor of the United States. The Chinese have shifted a lot in the last 2 years to developing their internal market. But in doing so, they've actually used their banks almost in exactly the same way that the United States was using its banks in the 1990s. In other words, they're perpetuating the same system inside of China today as the one that crashed in the United States right now. So for me, my bet is that the Chinese economy will be in real serious difficulty within 10 years, because the kinds of investments they're doing in highways and dams and, urban infrastructures and so on, and high-speed trains and the like, are the sorts of things you won't find out whether they really are highly productive until about 10 years' time.
Well, entering in the issue of the current crisis, as you said, its beginning, its origins are in the steps taken to solve the crisis of the 70s. What has really changed since then?
The big issue in the 1970s was labor control, capitalist control over labor supply. And there was a labor market problem. Wages were, in the advanced capitalist world, were relatively high. Labor was well organized. It had a lot of political power. It had political power through political parties in Europe and so on, and it was exercising that power. So if you go back and look at what was going on at the end of the 1960s and 1970s, early 1970s in the United States and Italy and so on, tremendous labor struggles are going on, and capital needs to discipline labor. And it set about disciplining labor in a number of different ways. One was through globalization, you know, take capital to where labor is freely available. Another was through technological change. Another was through immigration. In those early stages, they thought they could solve the problem by immigration. For example, the French actually subsidized the Maghrebi and North African laborers to come into France. The Germans brought in the Turks. The British brought in people from the Empire, and there was a huge reform of US immigration in 1965 that allowed all people of the world to come into the United States. So there was a tremendous kind of concern about controlling labor because labor was so powerful. But by the time you get to 1980s and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and of course General Pinochet and all of that, they put the end, if you like, to the political power of labor. So there was wage repression. And the result of that is you would not say the current crisis has anything to do with the excessive power of labor. If anything, the current crisis has to do with the excessive power of capital. Right? Now, the trouble with repressing labor and repressing wages is that you actually find that what the data show is that the share of wages in national income in almost every country in the world went down. Now, if wages are going down, it means there's less market power to buy the goods that capitalists are making. And then the question arises, well, what's happening to your market when you're repressing wages? And the answer in the United States was, give them credit. Let them buy on credit. So you get the debt economy that arises, which is this huge kind of business which the banks get into, and US households, for example, tripled their debt in about 30 years. And so, in a way, the loss of demand from falling wages was covered by rising debt. But when wages are going down and individual debt is rising, at some point or other, there's a real problem of how on earth people are going to pay off their debts. And that was something that began to occur in the late 1990s, and then that too was a signal part of the current crash.
Now, questioning the future of capitalism, you return to Marx to explain how the system has been successful in keeping always the relations between his 7 fundamental moments that allowed the transition from feudalism. Can you resume for us these 7 moments working together?
Well, the easiest way to do this is, instead of talking about all 7, because when you talk about all 7, you're talking about all of these interrelations between them. But consider, for example, the relationship between just 3 of them. You have production system. And the big question always about production is what kind of technology is going to be embedded in the production system. And as the production system evolved, so new technologies had to be invented. The new technologies that came about demanded a complete reorganization of people's mental conceptions of the world. That is, you had to see the world as something that could be scientifically and technologically managed. And I think it's very interesting that in the early years of capitalism, what we would call in societies concerned with industry were always called arts. So industry was considered an art, not a science and a technology. And that had to shift, and people had to say, we can break down production processes and see them scientifically and set up, you know, these new technologies. So, but that meant we had to understand nature in a completely different way. In other words, the natural world couldn't be mysterious anymore. When I'm talking about the evolution of all of these elements together, I'm saying the transition from feudalism to capitalism was not just one of those elements. It was all of them moving together. Mm-hmm. And at the same time...
And this is something that capitalism kept in movement.
Kept in movement,
until today.
Yes, yes.
Do you think that today you can see,
for
instance, in the crisis of the 70s,
yes.
During the 70s, what we have seen was exactly all these moments moving together.
Yes. No, I mean, I'm old enough to remember what it was like living in the 1970s. And if I ask myself, well, what were the dominant technologies? No cell phones, no laptops. Could you imagine living without that? And the mental conceptions were also very, very different, including, of course, political sensibilities. There's much more concern with social solidarities, things of that kind. We've now become much more individualistic. We become individuals on our cell phones and with our, on our screens. So all of this has changed, and daily life has changed radically, which is one of the other moments that I talk about. So one of the geniuses of capitalism is to keep all of those 7 elements in perpetual motion.
Do you believe that this dialectical movement between the 7 moments is a sort of slowing down on these days?
It's so difficult at the time to see what the motion is. In some ways, it's always easier to reconstruct after the event, after things have happened. Well, what was it that went on in the 1970s? I think it took me, and I'm a very concerned analyst. It took me into about the 1990s to figure out what the 1970s was really about, because by then I could see elements that were going on there which then became very prominent in the 1990s.